to this year's Powell Jr. Distinguished Lecture Series. Several years ago, students started this series as a tribute to our esteemed alumnus, Justice Powell. And each year, the lecture board, comprised solely of students, maintains that tribute and invites one speaker to deliver the lecture. Past speakers range from various backgrounds and professions, yet each speaker shares two traits. First, an admiration of Justice Powell, and second, an embodiment of those values that Justice Powell himself personified. It is with great pleasure that I have the opportunity to introduce this year's lecturer, Mr. Lyle Denniston. Mr. Denniston is in his 54th year of covering the U.S. Supreme Court, having covered 1/4 of the justices ever to sit on the bench. He has covered end-to-end the full careers of 10 justices, including our very own Justice Powell. Since 2004, he has been lead reporter for SCOTUSblog, an online clearinghouse of information about the court's work. He's the author of The Reporter and the Law, a manual that remains of wide use in newsrooms and academic journalism, and has written numerous articles in law reviews and other publications. He has taught at a variety of colleges and universities, including 8 years teaching the legal process at Georgetown University Law Center. He's a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of the University of Nebraska and has a master's degree in American history from Georgetown. He's also a member of the Hall of Fame of the Washington chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. The accolades continue. For the interest of understanding my own significance, I will defer to this year's speaker. His lecture is entitled From Plyler v. Doe to Trayvon Martin, or Closing the Open Society. Please join me in welcoming the 2012 Powell Jr. Distinguished Lecturer, Mr. Lyle Denniston.
Thank you, Parker. When you get to be my age and you come up to a podium where there are lilies and a white drape, you begin to wonder. I'm grateful, however, for the decorations, and particularly delighted with the opportunity to talk with you. Excuse me. I don't have a speaking voice. As a matter of fact, when I was in the high school choir, I don't have a singing voice either. Every now and then the choir director would say, "Can we stop and try it without Lyle?" And I am not paid to have a really stentorian voice. I speak through my written word only. It's a delight to have the opportunity to stay in that wonderful mansion on the top of the hill. I'm told it was built in 1827. I was just a kid then. But we always looked up to the hill around here. Seriously, it is a genuine pleasure to be here tonight. I have had the distinguished privilege to know Lewis Powell personally, and I'd like to share with you a story that I heard about him. I heard from a student here when I was here some years ago. This was a young man whose father apparently was a close personal friend of Justice Powell. And his father was having some conversation with Justice Powell in his chambers in Washington, and happened to mention that his son had not yet chosen an undergraduate college. And Justice Powell said, well, by all means, he's got to go to Washington and Lee. And they talked about that for a little bit, this young man's father and Justice Powell. But the topic soon faded away, and they talked about other things. And when the interview was over, this boy's father left Justice Powell's chambers and started walking down the hallway at the court. And Justice Powell came out of his chambers, literally running after him, and said, no, let's say his name was Joseph. Joseph, I really mean it. He has got to go to Washington and Lee. Whereupon Justice Powell ticked off with exquisite precision the mileage distance from the Washington and Lee campus to each of the girls' schools, Mary Baldwin and all of the others. So the young man actually took the advice and came here, and I am sure had a very distinguished career. Let me say that I must bring to you Washington, greetings from Washington, where, if you can imagine, you will be reassured to know that we are debating Marbury versus Madison all over again. On the way down here today, I literally dictated a story to the blog about the letter that the Attorney General filed with the Fifth Circuit, taking the government's position on whether Marbury versus Madison was still good law and whether it was an inhibition upon this administration. It's fun to talk about Marbury versus Madison. It's even more fun to watch the Attorney General write a letter to 3 judges and refuse to introduce the letter by saying the Honorable. The letter just begins Judge Smith, Judge Garza, and Judge Southwick, which was a little bit of a needle on Mr. Holder's part. Also, they were instructed to file a 3-page single-spaced letter, which was kind of an insult in its own right, but Holder's letter stops halfway between the top and the bottom of page 3. So a little bit of not exactly contemptible behavior, but being his own person. But let me turn to my lecture, and Parker has given you my title. But let me start by saying it is such a privilege and such a high honor to be asked to deliver this speech, and I know I'm in exquisitely good company. I was not aware until I got here this evening all of the people who had delivered this lecture before, and I'm humbled by the company in which I find myself. It's really rewarding to me to know that Justice Powell's papers are here, because I know those papers will reveal to anyone who uses them, what an incredible judicial career he had. Even though it began reluctantly, he really did not want to be a member of the Supreme Court. He had a quite full life without it. But he was, as you know from his record, terribly important in his service on the court, frequently making majorities in a very divided court that was led by a very divisive Chief Justice, Warren Burger. But Lewis also stood courageously alone when he felt he had to do so. I also want to mention, obviously, my debt to Parker Kasmer, because Parker has made it very easy for me to be with you here tonight, because he's kind of nursed me along and promised me this and promised me that and got me to agree to do this. He's really been a strong support, and I very much appreciate that. This is quite a sober lecture, somber even, but I hope you will stay with me, and I hope you finish your interest at the same time that I finish my remarks. When I'm concluded, if it doesn't delay your evening pleasures, I'd be delighted to take questions for as long as you want to stay, because I have very nice lodgings up on the top of the hill, and I don't have any other plans for the evening, so we can spend it together. Let me then turn, if I can, to my topic, and start with an opinion that Justice Powell wrote almost exactly 30 years ago. It was a separate concurring opinion in the case of Plyler versus Doe. The case did have a secondary title, and that title is far more descriptive of what was going on in the case. It was Texas versus certain named and unnamed undocumented children. Texas versus the children. Justice Powell's opinion, a separate opinion in that case, speaks of an open society that, in my mind, no longer exists in this country for undocumented immigrants. You will know my sensitivity on this particular subject when I tell you that, as I write stories today about it, I refuse to describe such human beings as aliens. Still, the actual and potential closing of an open society goes well beyond the fate of those who live in America without legal permission to be here. The trend is, for me, apparent in a variety of current policies and legal developments, perhaps very different from each other in fundamental ways, but in combination, They are moving people or ideas beyond the pale, or indeed out of sight altogether. We find it much easier these days, it seems, to define something of which we are ignorant, or something that stirs fear in us, as necessarily to be excluded from our little circle of acceptance. Part of it has to do with the creation of pariah classes, pushed into the category of the other. Another part of it has to do with the refusal to confront openly and candidly very deep wrongs. And part of it has to do with intentionally clogging or closing the channels of public discourse. The phenomenon extends to such strange places as the military garrison with its wire enclosures at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. In order to detain, perhaps for the remainder of their lives for some of them, a class of people we want nowhere near our shores and are unwilling to bring before our courts so that their fate might be decided in a just manner. That is creation of the other. It reaches to the fearsome prison that exists outside of Kabul in Afghanistan, where we have chosen to place another group of people detained as terrorism suspects, precisely to put them beyond the reach of our nation's courts of law. Further, it reaches to the impenetrable wall of secrecy that surrounds a national policy that is slowly but perceptibly turning the entire American intelligence apparatus into a lethal military machine that does not even exempt U.S. citizens from its retribution. Some of those developments may be known to you, but there is more, much more, in areas of our culture where the free exploration had seemed the norm before. There's a determined effort. It was stalled for the time being by a true internet uprising to put severe new restraints on the openness of digital culture. The Supreme Court is also a part of this. It has recently declared that there is no guarantee that a public domain in literature and music has any constitutional claim to remain open when the juggernaut of Hollywood-driven copyright bears down upon it. And there is the steady march of intolerance against people because of the color of their skin or the nature of their sexual identity. We have come to the place, it seems, where a black teenager can be slain in the street by a neighborhood sentinel, and we are left to debate not the inexplicable reason for such an act, but whether it was legally justified by a barrel-chested law that tells one to stand your ground. And we have come to the place, it is obvious, where three distinguished judges of a state Supreme Court can be denied re-election solely because they interpreted an equality guarantee in their state constitution to allow for same-sex marriage. I happened to sit beside, last week at a conference in Williamsburg, Marcia Turnus, who is one of the three Supreme Court justices who was denied re-election because of that unanimous opinion recognizing same-sex marriage in Iowa. It was my experience that you would never meet a more wholesome or real, tender human being than Marcia Turnus. In the face of such unsettling times, let me start over again and go back with Lewis Powell and those undocumented alien children in Texas. The Texas legislature, you may know this story, had passed a law barring local school districts from using any state funds to finance the education of children who are not legal residents of this country, and to deny such children even entry into the public domain, public schools, by a vote of 5-4 in Plyler versus Doe. The Supreme Court found that statute to be a violation of the equal protection guarantee of the 14th Amendment. Justice Powell, as I said earlier, wrote separately even while joining the majority opinion that was written by Justice Brennan. Recalling that the court had previously made clear that children are not to be condemned for the misdeeds of their parents, Justice Powell wrote, and I quote, "The classification at issue deprives a group of children of the opportunity for education afforded all other children simply because they have been assigned a legal status due to a violation of law by their parents. These children thus have been singled out for a lifelong penalty and stigma. A legislative classification that threatens the creation of future citizens and residents cannot be reconciled with one of the fundamental purposes of the 14th Amendment," unquote. Those words, as you hear them, are phrased as law, but they are infused with a sense of the decency that was so much a part of the work of Lewis Powell. There is in those phrases not the remotest hint of intolerance. He laments, indeed, the failure of the federal government to police the border better, but he refuses to make the children pay for that governmental lapse. Viewed from today's perspective, Lewis Powell's vision of an inclusive society, one generous in its acceptance of people who look and are different from the majority, seems somewhat dated, somewhat unreal, perhaps somewhat naive. Move forward with me from Plyler versus Doe and leap across 30 years, and one encounters a seemingly different world. One encounters, for example, a state law like Alabama's HB 56. One of the provisions of that new state law turns public school officials into immigration enforcers, requiring all public schools in the state to determine if each child entering any grade was born outside the U.S. or is a child of an illegal alien parent. Because of Plyler versus Doe, of course, they cannot be barred from school altogether, but the information gathered about them can provide the basis for their, or at least their parents' deportation in what would surely be a crisis for many families. Cross over the border into Louisiana. Officials of that state recently asked the Supreme Court to forbid the federal government from counting any undocumented immigrants living anywhere in the United States, and it asked the court to order the government to recalculate the 2010 census without counting those immigrants. It was an undisguised effort, ladies and gentlemen, to declare such people entirely outside the American political community, because the census data, as you know, is used to calculate the distribution of seats in the House of Representatives. It is a fact, indeed, that since the first census in 1790, all such undocumented persons have been counted every time. The court, perhaps wisely, turned down that request without comment last month. But that did not take away the message that Louisiana's legal maneuver had sent. And indeed, it does not prevent Louisiana from beginning its challenge all over again in a lower court. In addition, near the end of this month, the Supreme Court will hold a hearing on SB 1070. That's the Arizona law that seeks to control the lives of undocumented immigrants living in that state, controls that are potentially so onerous that they could only be expected to drive many of those people out of the state altogether, and that is precisely its goal. In a nation where by the year 2050, according to the Census Bureau, 54% of the total population will be made up of minorities. These gestures among the states appear to be remarkable efforts to stand against history, and driven as they often are by claims of rampant crime by such immigrants, they add to a pervasive complex of fear. It is that very fear, I would suggest, that took the life of 17-year-old Trayvon Benjamin Martin on a pleasant street named Retreat View Circle in Sanford, Florida, on February 26. The story, as we know it so far, is that a neighborhood watch volunteer in a gated community, George Zimmerman, felt the need to pursue that young black man wearing a hooded sweatshirt. Zimmerman was diligent about it. He apparently kept up the pursuit, even though a police dispatcher told him when he called in, "Okay, we don't need you to do that." There apparently was a scuffle between the two, and in a moment, Trayvon Martin lay in the grass, bleeding to death from a gunshot wound to the chest. Whatever we may assume about racial tension and its possible role in that tragic incident, we do know that it occurred in a community that wanted to be insulated from the threats that lay beyond its gate and beyond its fences. That subdivision's very name, the Retreat at Twin Lakes, tells of a desire to be left alone by the rest of the world. But if we are to believe the findings that have been made in a new book by Rich Benjamin, such gated communities in our country are creating a new cultural reality in America, and it is one in which the incident in Sanford, Florida, may have been quite predictable. Benjamin is a black author whose book is titled Searching for Whiteopia, an improbable journey to the heart of white America. He spent 2 years traveling to see what life would be like in predominantly white gated communities all across the country. The book, I suspect, will take its place in the annals of America's great cultural studies alongside such classics as Robert and Helen Lynn's Middletown, their social science reflections on Muncie, Indiana, Thornton Wilder's play Our Town, about the fictional village of Grover's Corners, New Hampshire, and Sinclair Lewis's satirical novel Babbitt, about a businessman busily climbing the social ladder in the fictional town of Zenith, somewhere in the Midwest. Rich Benjamin's judgment about a typical gated community is harsh indeed. As he described his findings in a column in the New York Times last week, he said such a community is, quote, self-contained, conservative, and overzealous in its demands for safety. Gated communities, he said, quote, churn a vicious cycle by attracting like-minded residents who seek shelter from outsiders and whose physical seclusion then worsens paranoid groupthink against outsiders. Those communities have, he said, a bunker mentality. If Benjamin is right, the presence of a hooded black teenager on a residential street at nighttime would be the very personification of the other, a disturber of domestic tranquility. And in the context of my remarks here, what happened to Trayvon Martin may be yet another example of the closing down of an open society. The phenomenon, unfortunately, does not stop there. Reflect for a moment on the bunker mentality that has developed as America confronted global terrorism in the wake of the attacks of September 11, 2001. Former Vice President Cheney's 1% doctrine exhibited that very attitude. If there is a 1% chance that an act of terrorism will occur, it will, in fact, occur, and preparation must be made to head it off, whatever the cost. We have 171 human beings still housed in the military prison at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and most of them have been cleared for release, but they have nowhere to go. The Congress of the United States has decreed that they cannot be brought to this country. In effect, the lawmakers have declared that the entirety of America is a gated community that these people dare not enter. Congress also has mandated that if a Guantanamo prisoner should be sent to any other country in the world, their lives thereafter must be controlled by conditions that no self-respecting sovereign nation would agree to accept within its own borders. Hence, many simply stay at Guantanamo. There's a young man, 25-year-old Omar Khader, 17 months ago, Omar pleaded guilty to war crimes on an agreement in which he would be sent home after 1 year to live in Canada, his home. He is still at Guantanamo. He's been there since he was 15 years old because the Canadian government now refuses to accept him back home. 4 years ago, the Supreme Court of the United States declared that those at Guantanamo had a constitutional right to enter an American court to challenge their continued confinement and a chance to obtain, yes, actual release. But the Federal Appeals Court in Washington, in a string of decisions that goes all the way back to 2004, has hollowed out that legal remedy to the point where a judge on that court has said publicly that he does not believe that any of his colleagues would uphold any federal judge's order to release anyone from Guantanamo if there were even the slightest chance that they are, in fact, inclined toward terrorism. The problem is that terrorism is now defined so loosely that no one can know precisely what it means. And it is not even clear that increasingly limited legal option declared by the Supreme Court, while open to those at Guantanamo Bay, in name anyway, is available for hundreds of other prisoners that the U.S. military holds at a prison in Afghanistan. Soon, those prisoners' fates may be determined entirely by the Afghan government after control of that prison is handed over to local authorities. Certainly, the government of our country faces fierce and awesomely complex challenges on what to do about terrorism. I do not doubt that. But surely we do not need to send the Constitution into wartime exile as part of our response. We seem also to have put the Constitution and its core concept of checks and balances on hold as we seek to know how the government is actually waging a war on terrorism. A doctrine of state secrets that began in a Supreme Court decision in 1950 as a limited means of excluding specific items of evidence bearing on national security from being explored in a court case has now mushroomed into a doctrine that shuts down judicial inquiry altogether, merely upon a classified declaration by a government security official. And I have talked to lawyers who have seen these classified documents that are the basis for holding people and for the state secrets doctrine. And while they will not share with me exactly what they have seen because they are under mandates of secrecy themselves, they have said that quite commonly the claims of national security are frequently exaggerated and are often based on no more than unfiltered raw intelligence of an extremely dubious kind. There is a world of difference, of course, between an open society and a national security state. But one must ask whether there is no middle ground. Is there no way by which the judiciary can inquire into the use of torture as a means of intelligence gathering? 3 times the Supreme Court has denied review of attempts to overcome the state secrets privilege in order to examine torture claims. Is there no means by which the judiciary can examine the policy of targeted killing, even of U.S. citizens abroad who are deemed to be a terrorist threat? The Supreme Court has denied review of that case, too. And is there nowhere within the structure of our government where the secret world of a thoroughly militarized CIA can be meaningfully examined? Put another way, an abiding question for Americans of today, living in this frightened age, is whether accountability has become an unaffordable luxury, whether a faith in democratic principle is naively out of date. And there are other threats to the open society that we thought we had. Yes, there are. Of course, and they have nothing whatever to do with national security. I will note that America has never had an opportunity for openness to match what came with the arrival of the digital age. We know so much more about each other, including, one suspects, some things that we would just as soon not know. But leaving that aside, has any one of you in this audience never marveled about what could be reached with a click or two of a mouse? What a universe of ideas and experiences is out there. And so very much of it is available free. Free of cost, free of pre-digestion, free of censorship, free of bias, free of lunacy. The selection of what to examine and to absorb or reject is solely by unmediated private choice. And of course, I am not talking about the number of apps that you have on your phone that enable to live your life so much more conveniently. I would imagine that you have seen that TV commercial where one person has a great idea about something, only to be told by another person that it has already occurred minutes ago. It almost seems that we have created apps that allow time to run backwards. But the digital world is not as open as you might think, and there are very real signs that it may lose even more of its openness. From early on in this digital age, we have learned that electronic exploration and the concept of copyright were on a collision course, or at least were in considerable tension. You remember, I'm sure, the Grokster episode in which the Supreme Court informed us that the free trade in creative expression was not really very free after all. We have heard a lot about it since then, about piracy. But that episode was nothing, though, in comparison to the restraints on digital communication that proposed new federal legislation would bring about. The so-called Stop Online Piracy Act and variations of it appeared to be absolutely draconian to major players in the digital community. And just when it seemed that the major entertainment and recording companies had Congress in their control on this issue, the internet rose up in angry protest in January and drove the legislation off of the calendars in both the House and the Senate. So much for a passive citizenry. But we are told the anti-piracy movement is far from dead. It is just lying in wait for another opportunity. One very unsettling facet about that entire episode was that among the loudest cheerleaders for the legislation was none other than the nation's most fervent champion of the First Amendment and its freedoms, renowned New York lawyer Floyd Abrams. One can be reasonably certain, I would suggest, that if the Stop Online Piracy Act, or some version of it, does emerge from Congress at any point, its validity will be upheld by the Supreme Court as long as the court's current prevailing view of copyright holds. While the Constitution speaks of copyright as protected only for, quote, limited times, unquote, the court in Eldred versus Ashcroft in 2003 upheld the concept that limited doesn't really mean very limited. That decision validated the Hollywood-initiated Sonny Bono Act that extended existing copyright protection on many creative works, including Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, at least in constitutional terms for many years, very long periods of time. And Eldred, it seems, did not reach the outermost expansion of copyright law. Just this past January, in the case of Golan versus Holder, the Supreme Court essentially destroyed, at least in constitutional terms, the concept of a public domain. For at least the past 30 years, scholars have been developing the notion that when a once copyrighted work reaches the end of that monopoly protection, it enters into a public domain that has its own claim to constitutional protection under the First Amendment. There was a conference at Duke Law School 7 years ago that extensively explored the constitutional implications of creating and maintaining a public domain, it is a serious proposition. Works that had never been put under copyright in the U.S. were already in the public domain, including Peter and the Wolf. And so, it was argued, they could not be withdrawn from the public domain into a copyrighted status. Well, so much for an idea that had matured over 30 years. The Golan decision explicitly rejected that idea as a constitutionally grounded principle. Those who have been using for their own purposes a literary or musical work that has been in the public domain do not thereby acquire any First Amendment protection against having such a work newly copyrighted, the court concluded. No one, the court declared, obtains any personal right under the Constitution to copy or perform a work just because it has come out from under earlier copyright protection or has never been copyrighted at all in the United States. So no one can object if copyright is later confirmed. Any legal rights that exist belong only to the author or composer, Justice Ginsburg wrote. And to add to the indignity of this insult to the idea of the public domain, the court's opinion brushed aside the claim of constitutional protection in a footnote. Footnote 26 for the digital world will be as famous as footnote 4 in the Caroline Products case. The greatest casualty of the Eldred and Golan decisions, of course, is the idea of a global digital library. That library has been developing in recent years and has been profoundly dependent upon the existence of a viable public domain. The risk to an open society of creative expression is now beyond dispute. Even granting that some measure of copyright protection does contribute to the creative urge in artists, writers, and composers. How long, we may ask, must it exist before it stifles further creative expression that is derived from an original work? I would like then to turn to a final and probably more controversial threat to an open society. I refer, of course, to the effort pursued in so many sectors of our public policy and our civic discourse to exclude gays and lesbians from an equal role in society and its institutions, especially in those central institutions in mainstream culture, marriage, and the military. And this, of course, gives me an opportunity, which I welcome, to return to Lewis Powell and his approach to life and the law. The gay rights issue overall, I will say to you frankly, is among the most agonizing public questions confronting America today. And Lewis Powell's own struggle with it was itself very agonizing. That is painfully spelled out in John Jeffrey's wonderful biography of Justice Powell. Jeffrey's ultimate conclusion is that, quote, on this issue, Powell never found the middle ground. Jeffrey's chapter on Bowers versus Hardwick, the 1986 decision refusing to recognize constitutional equality for sexual intimacy among homosexuals, spelled out in details Justice Powell's role in that case, switching sides but ultimately voting with the majority. In a real sense, Powell, even then, recognized the long-range constitutional implications of that controversy, the effect that could be expected on marriage and the military, and he fretted deeply about that. Although he would say 4 years later that he had made a mistake in Bowers and that the dissenters there, quote, had the better of the arguments, unquote. It is far from clear, though, that his mind and heart were ever settled on the ultimate question of gay equality. He died 5 years before Bowers was explicitly overruled in Lawrence versus Texas, which, of course, set the constitutional stage for challenges to the exclusion of gays, both from the military and from the civil institution of marriage. America is probably more open politically to homosexual equality than it was in Lewis Powell's day, and that ultimately may make a constitutional difference. The resolution of the issue, though, could certainly use as part of the discussion the sense of decency and humility that was so much a part of Lewis Powell's life. When one delivers a memorial lecture like this one, in honor of a person who is no longer with us, there may be a strong temptation to enlist that celebrated person as an ally on one side or the other of contemporary controversy. One might ask a variation of that popular question of today, what would Lewis Powell say? And one might pretend to know the answer. I have no idea how he would have reacted to each or any one of the specific examples I have put forth here, or even on the general question of what I see as the accelerating trend toward closing an open society. I have to believe, however, that he would have counseled caution and prudence, the exercise of measured judgment, and the patience to hear what the other side might have to say. Lewis Powell was a conservative, as a man and as a justice, but I do not mean by that to place him in a static category along a fixed ideological spectrum. His conservatism seemed to me always to bespeak his belief that even society's most intractable problems could be resolved if calm judgment were brought to bear in a spirit of mutual respect and accommodation. Many of the views that I have stated here today are, I recognize, at least tinged with values that most would recognize in today's political parlance as liberal in nature. I would feel, however, that I had failed if they were received here only in that way. The openness of American society is not a liberal or a conservative cause. It is the essence of a society unafraid of change or of diversity. The character of a society that appreciates that time never stands still and that civic reform is never fully done. And it is a society that looks forward to each new journey along what I hope is an open road, remembering the advice that John Milton gave to the English Parliament nearly 4 centuries ago, quote, "He who thinks we are to pitch our tents here and thus have attained the utmost prospect of reformation, that man by this very opinion declares that he is yet far short of truth." Thank you very much. Well, I think the dominant thing is fear. It is, as you walk around the Supreme Court of the United States, every day you have visible evidence of fear. It used to be that you could walk easily into the court. The court's front is now ringed with permanent barriers so that no truck full of explosives can pull up on the steps. You go through, and entering the court, you go through a magnetometer that doesn't just detect guns, it detects biological material, the most sophisticated screening system you can imagine. 2 years ago, the court closed its front door so that you cannot enter. You can leave by the front door, you cannot enter. It is astonishing to walk up those grand steps and see a door that is closed. And we live every day in Washington under a climate of unbelievable fear. And that fear, it seems to me, is being energized by the degree to which we are unable to converse with each other on issues of grave public concern without shouting, without lying to each other, without demonizing each other. And I think all of that comes out of a culture where one's neighbors are not to be trusted. And I frankly do not see the end of it. At my age, I certainly will not live beyond this time to see a time when people once again could engage each other at a level of the way that Lewis Powell engaged people who disagreed with him. I hope that golden age comes, but I'm very fearful that it won't. Well, I'm not sure that the movement to control copyright, the extension of the copyright period and the destruction of the public domain is driven, I think, by a sense that the digital community has gotten so far out of hand that nobody's ownership rights are secure anymore. And I have believed for a very long time, as you probably have already detected, I'm a passionate believer in free expression. As a matter of fact, my sloop, which my wife and I sail on the Chesapeake Bay, is named Free Expression. I believe that the copyright clause has always been in open conflict with the First Amendment. Even if you accept, for the sake of an argument, that some initial period of monopoly rights does energize creativity, you have to ask your question, at what point should that monopoly cease? At what point do derivative works have a claim upon an opportunity to succeed? And if you extend copyright over and over again, the copyright is now, it used to be 14 years. Some copyrights have been extended to 90 years. What happens to derivative works if that's true? And I invite you to read the text of the Online Piracy Act, Stop Online Piracy Act. And we are talking here about an Orwellian response to the problem of piracy. And the very word piracy, of course, conveys a notion that this is wholly illegitimate. But another quote of John Milton's that's a favorite of mine is, whoever heard truth put to the worse in free and open combat? Let's let ideas blossom. Mao told us that a long time ago, but we apparently haven't taken it seriously in Western culture yet. I think the conventional wisdom is way out ahead of the curve on what's going to happen. If you watch a lot of oral argument in the Supreme Court, and I was talking about this earlier with my colleague here, the first half of an argument is very often commentary upon what's in the briefs. The justices will say something that their clerk's memo has included. For example, Justice Kennedy's first question is, can you create commerce in order to regulate commerce? That's a direct quote from Paul Clement's brief, all right? But as the justices get into an argument, they start speaking for themselves. And so I have always followed a practice: in the first hour, take a few notes. In the second hour, pay close attention within an inch of your capacity, because the second hour is where you hear what the justices are really thinking. So it takes a while to rev up these young people. But Kennedy and the Chief, and even Alito's comments and we're talking about the Tuesday argument. The first day's argument is a lost cause for those who want to kick this down the road, except, I'll tell you an except in a minute. So most of the commentary is focused on Tuesday and the mandate. And as you pointed out, the conventional wisdom is that the mandate is gone. But the mandate is gone only if you believe that the process is already over. I mean, there is still probably 3 months of really tough deliberation going on. And there is a dynamic in this particular case that few of us outside the court really know its depth, but it's going on. Is that here's a court that is sensitive about Bush versus Gore. This is a court that is sensitive about Citizens United versus FEC. This is a court that knows full well that it's going to drop this bomb in the middle of a presidential campaign in which its role and the constitutional role and the federal government versus state government are central issues. Now, if you don't think that's an intimidating prospect to a Supreme Court justice, you must accept the notion that all they do is vote the way they think the president who appointed them wants them to do. I have never believed that canard. I don't believe it now. I will tell you, and this will probably blow all of you away, Bush versus Gore was correctly decided. Not because of whom it put in the White House, but because it resolved a constitutional crisis that was going to be resolved nowhere else. And that's why we have a Supreme Court, folks. That's what we've been talking about since Marbury versus Madison. That's where judgment ultimately is exercised on a constitutional question. So this is a court that is not going to leap into another conflict. I mean, John Roberts is a thin-skinned person. There's no question about it. And he was really upset about what the president said at the State of the Union message. He has said on public platforms, this is not internal information, he has said on public platforms that he almost walked out. Okay. But he also is a Chief Justice who is keenly sensitive to the court's historical reputation and its institutional integrity. John Roberts will not vote in this case in order to smite Barack Obama. And he might actually wind up in a majority on this. And my own expectation is, and you can call me up and tell me what a fool you were on July 1st, my expectation is that we're going to get a 6-3 vote to uphold the mandate. And now let me give you the except. If we get to, let's say, the 15th of June, and the court cannot compose an opinion on the mandate issue that can attract any more than 5 votes, I don't think the chief wants it decided by 5-4. At that point, somebody may say, well, we've always got the Anti-Injunction Act. Let's find that this is a jurisdictional statute, that it applies to this case, and let's put aside the challenge to the mandate until after it goes into effect. A very, very high quality opinion stating just that was written in the DC Circuit by Brett Kavanaugh. Very, very conservative judge, a brilliant judge actually. And so the argument is there. It could be at work in the dynamic. So we may kick this down the road. And Judge Kavanaugh said flatly, he said, we may not ever need to decide this because there is going to be an election on November the 6th. And it may well be that the fate of the ACA is going to be settled that day rather than on the day the Supreme Court decides. The newspapers in this country are almost dead. So if you're aspiring to a career in daily print journalism, that's a pipe dream. Okay? There aren't that many jobs, there aren't that many newspapers. Unless you are willing to go to a place like Syracuse, Nebraska, Ottumwa, Iowa, little towns that still need their local newspaper. There's no other meaningful commercial distribution network than a local newspaper. You can't advertise in the Omaha World Herald if you want to sell something in my hometown of Nebraska City. You've got to advertise in the news press. So those little papers are going to survive. And I started in one. I went to work at the Nebraska City News Press when I was 17 years old. By the way, I can remember my very first story. The lead on the story was an elderly couple was injured in an auto accident south of the city last night. George Brown, 43, and his wife, Marilyn, 41, were not seriously injured. I had an 80-year-old editor who took that copy and said, "What do you think elderly means?" And I said, "Well, doesn't it mean somebody older than me?" And I was 17 at the time. But I will tell you this, when I came up, and I'm sorry this isn't true anymore, but when I was 17 years old, you could pick a career target and you could go for broke on it. And you could make your own way. I mean, sometimes you need sharp elbows. But you do need a sense of where you're going to go and how you're going to wind up there. And and I think about maybe 6 months into my career working for a small town newspaper in Nebraska, I knew I wanted to cover the courthouse. Because every morning I had a beat. I would go up to the courthouse and cover whatever was going on there, and then I'd go to the police station and go to the Chamber of Commerce, find out what local business is doing. And then in the evening cover some local sports event. And I knew from that time that I wanted to cover the Supreme Court of the United States. And so I took a beeline for it. It took me a while to get there, but when and at the end I was really kind of pushing people aside. But I was better than they were, so it was appropriate that they be pushed aside. So what I'm telling you is, believe in yourself, pick your career aspirations, and go for it. But you have to remember there are limitations. I mean, and journalism, I think it was Newsweek that maybe a year ago had a piece that they had picked out a day, I think it was in 2017, when the last newspaper would be published in this country. Well, I mean, that's nonsense because the little local papers are going to know. But I would tell you from my own experience over the last 8 years, the real future in journalism is online. And what is really encouraging to me, that online journalism is becoming increasingly serious, increasingly professional, and increasingly admired and respected by thinking people. I mean, I'll just give an example. My little blog started in 2001. A young man named Tom Goldstein and his wife, Amy Howe, wanted to develop a boutique practice only before the U.S. Supreme Court. So they created a little blog called SCOTUSblog as a business development tool. Within 2 years, they were billing $1 million in the firm. They built a practice out of it. In 2004, I tried for the third time to retire. It didn't work again. And so I called up Tommy Goldstein and I said, "Could you use a Supreme Court report?" He said, "Oh my God, yes, come on over, let's do it." So I have done that now for 8 years, and it is my total liberation. I mean, I don't have any deadlines, I don't have any editor, I don't have any assignments. And my Pamela tells me it means you work all the time. But the point I wanted to make is on the day that the mandate was argued, SCOTUSblog had 840,000 hits by 6 p.m. 840,000 hits. That's more than the daily circulation of USA Today, isn't it, Tony?
Pretty close, yeah.
Pretty close. And this is a blog that, that has created a niche. And this, I would tell you this, one of the virtues of online journalism is that you can always create a new niche. And somebody will come to it. I mean, look at the Huffington Post, a lot of people think, that Ms. Huffington is a kind of a fool, but she's not a business fool. She has created something really great. Well, Tommy Goldstein and Amy Howe did as well, you see. But we have, my blog has a lot of respect. And it earned that respect by taking legal news seriously. And the other virtue of that, of online journalism, is you hear from your audience. I mean, I was in the newspaper business ever since 1948. And I think I could probably count on both hands the number of times I heard from a reader. Not very many, over many decades. I hear from people all over the world now. People send me emails from Indonesia, for God's sakes, because they're reading about the Supreme Court of the United States. And so there is, and you think of this as only an electronic medium, but it's a very intimate medium. I have a daily conversation with my readers. They are telling me, God knows they point out my errors. When I'm on public platforms, particularly before lawyers' audiences, I always like to say, I never went to law school except to teach. And that's true. I mean, as Parker told you, I taught for 8 years in Georgia. I came in the side door, by the way. There was a fellow, I had met him at a wonderful conference at the Aspen Institute. And he had been teaching the UCC for 25 years at Georgetown in the adjunct program and was sick of it. I mean, I can imagine teaching the UCC for one day and being sick of it. But he said, you know, we had a good conversation after one of these sessions. He said, how would you like to teach jurisprudence? Oh, so yeah, let's do it. So we put together a plan for a course in jurisprudence in the adjunct program and the night program at Georgetown Law Center. And we went to the dean. The dean says, no way. At Georgetown Law Center, you have to have a PhD in philosophy to teach jurisprudence. So my friend and I, Martin Thaler, we taught a jurisprudence course, but we called it legal process. And we used Hart and Sachs, and we had a wonderful time teaching jurisprudence. Well, unfortunately, and Martin brought me in the side door because I don't have a law degree. So he brought me in the side door. We taught it for 4 years, and unfortunately, Martin died. And the dean said to me, would you like to keep teaching it? And I said, sure. So I taught it for another 4 years. I will confess to you that this is sticking my neck out. I think I could pass the bar. I don't want to try, but I think I could pass the bar. And I will say this, you can, if you just read a lot of law, and if you knew me as well as I know myself, you would say this guy is a bore. I don't read novels. I read judicial biography. I don't read very many newspapers. I read constitutional history. And I spend almost all of my waking hours reading court opinions, reading law review articles. I'm a stick in the mud, But I will say this, and please forgive me for saying this, but I'm very good at what I do because I am a student of it. And I have seen a lot of reporters come and go on the Supreme Court beat. And the ones that stick it out are the ones who come there determined to be students of the court.
All right. There's a tradition here at Washington Legal Law that when a student finishes his third year and is upon graduation, the school presents him with a walking stick.
Oh, I see.
And the walking stick is a means to commemorate the time they spent there and be a token, a reminder once they leave. And on behalf of the Powell board and the school as a whole, we would like to present you
thank you so
with
much.
one of the walking sticks as a token of our appreciation and also hopefully a reminder of the time you've had here
Thank
tonight.
you very much.
Thank you.
If I ever...
I'm sorry.
If I ever go to Sanford, Florida, I'm taking this with me.
Thanks again.